Hi, Bill.
I'll be
How you
right
doing, Melissa? Hanging in there?
Hello.
Hey. I'm going to ask Melissa if she will do the screen sharing for the slideshow presentation. And Bill, we had discussed we're going to, I don't know if she told you, but there's a slide or two that we might ask for you to jump in.
Okay.
A bit more expertise on the BMPs. How are you doing? Doing okay?
Good. Everything's good. Thank you.
Great. All right. I don't know if Melissa knows how many folks we're expecting. I actually just registered.
about 20.
Okay. Melissa, do you mind actually running the slides so I don't have technical issues? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Hi, folks that are just logging in. We're expecting about 20 people, so we'll give them a minute or two to log in before we get going.
John, it was so nice to meet you in person on the tour.
Yeah, it was fun going there. I didn't stay long. I'd like to meet more people involved here. Because I've been watching what's going on there for quite a while. I had a chance there because you look like recognizable faces, but I had to leave early.
No, it was great that you showed up. I appreciated it. And you guys will have to forgive me. I caught a bit of a head cold at some point, and so I'm just a little bit slow and a little bit fuzzy brained tonight.
John, it's okay. A lot of folks didn't go to the meeting that followed. So the tour was really well attended. The meeting was not.
Well, I went to the meeting and it was fascinating. I saw all you guys there, but I didn't introduce myself. I will next time.
Hi, Dan. Okay. We'll wait just another minute maybe, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
And just, I think all of you had received the notification, but we are recording.
Bill, you've been on a lot of these tours. What was your initial take? Was it similar to what you've been on before? Was the tone the same or different?
Well, what I thought was interesting is they had too many buses, like they wanted to split us up. So that was kind of a new thing, because the buses were, not even half full. And so they had the 3 buses, and it just seemed like they didn't want one main conversation going on. I don't know. Who knows?
Bill, I thought the same, but then what I realized, it was a pretty good COVID precaution. I was glad that we were able to spread out a little bit. That was kind of, we didn't have the windows down, but.
Right, that's true. The majority of people were wearing masks, so that was nice.
I thought it was ironic that the water board experts didn't wear a mask on the tour, but they did wear them at the meeting in the hotel after. So, all right, it is 7:02. Thank you, everyone who's here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Other people might join. Let me get my, hold on one sec. Sorry, apologize. Oh, no, slideshow. There we go. All right. Come on, internet. Okay. So this is a follow-up meeting to the surface water tour that was hosted by Boeing's expert panel last Thursday. And we just wanted to have a little bit of friendly discussion. Some of you were new to this. Some of you have been on tours like this before. Some of you have different, varying degrees of expertise with water, ground, and surface water issues. So you're all welcome to chime in. And this is being presented by Parents Against the Santa Susana Field Lab. So that's Jenny and me. Oh, here we go. Boeing's expert stormwater panel. So we mentioned in the flyers, if you got to see them, that the expert panel is paid by the Boeing Corporation. That's common knowledge, although they often act like they're actually part of the water panel. I'm sorry, there's so many acronyms and naming. There's the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board. That is a government agency. It is underneath California EPA. This expert panel is not part of the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board. This is a board put together by Boeing back in 2007 because of a cease and desist order they were given by the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board. It was formed in 2007. And these are all the same scientists who've been around the last 10, 15 years. And one of the main things that they deal with is the NPDES permit. That's the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. And that regulates how much contamination can flow offsite during rain events. And this is the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board sets what those limits are and enforces them. However, Boeing's limits for Boeing's NPDES are regularly exceeded. Boeing has been fined over $1 million for NPDES violations at the Santa Susana Field Lab.
I don't know if many of you remember, most of those fines that were that could have been and should have been enforced after the Woolsey fire. They had 57 exceedances that year. Most of them were not enforced. So this is just an overview of the outfalls. This is where the stormwater would discharge and be sampled. If the chemical or radioactive constituents were to exceed the permit levels, at this point, they should be fined, except for 01 and 02 at the bottom, the south of the site, where it says benchmark only. So they monitor, sample at those benchmarks, but they do not fine for exceedances at those. So I'm sure you all remember at the site, they were discussing how the different effluent from the different outfalls are routed to the Silvernell Pond. So all of those orange outfalls that would drain to the north to the Arroyo Simi and then the Cayugas Creek watershed, those are all fed to the Silvernell Pond. And then 11 is sent to the R1 pond on the right of the screen. 8 is not sent to a treatment center on the far right, but drains to Dayton Canyon and the Los Angeles River. Melissa, is there anything else you wanted to add about that?
No, thank you.
Okay.
The Santa Susana Field Lab has the potential to discharge approximately 187 million gallons of stormwater a day, that's stormwater runoff, that could contain pollutants from the facility. So that was kind of mind-blowing to me when I realized how much stormwater is moving. So this is a topographic view, so you can see that the Santa Susana Field Lab is in a much higher elevation than the cities and towns below.
Oh, can you go back to that slide? I just want to point something out, because you look at all of those crevices that are coming off that big, orange blob there. So each one of those crevices represents drainage coming off, and it makes its way down into the lower areas. We have a site, a nuclear field lab, rocket research facility that's 2,000 feet above sea level, and everything else is below. So all of those crevices are pathways of contamination.
That's a great point. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, and again, this is a lot of water to be coming off. So those are definitely being used.
Right. And when they were talking about the buffer zone contamination not being when they were being elusive about where that contamination could have been coming from, as you can see from this map, there is nothing above the Santa Susana Field Lab. There is no uphill contamination source.
Also, what's interesting is the groundwater wants to make its way to the ocean eventually, and you got ocean to the south of you. You can see it there, and you got ocean to the west of you. So it's kind of unknown, you know, where the groundwater contamination can extend through this fractured bedrock. But you know, it could go west, south, or any of those areas towards the ocean.
So it's fair to say that since the lab is at the top of the drainage system there, is it not fair to say that it is at pretty much the top of the Los Angeles headwaters, LA River headwaters?
Yeah, actually the Area 2 NASA portion, the Alpha test stands, is the headwaters of the LA River. And also you have the headwaters to the Arroyo Simi on the other side as well.
Yeah.
So the waterways at risk, as both of you were just mentioning, we'll start with the LA River. So the contaminated water from the SSFL, as Bill just said, impacts Bell Creek, Dayton Creek, Runkle Canyon, and the LA River, and potentially the Pacific Ocean. So drainage of the majority of the SSFL Area 4 flows into the Bell Creek drainage system, which is, again, the headwater and the tributary of the Los Angeles River. You can see on the other side in this map, maybe it's the next slide where we talk about the Cayugas Creek. Okay.
Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure this quote made it into our presentation is because Area 4 is where well, not all, but the great majority of the nuclear work took place. So the drainage coming into Bell Creek drainage system is especially at risk of being radioactive.
And that is, yeah, sorry to interrupt you. I'm a terrible interrupter. But that is something that was omitted from all discussions on both the site tour and the meeting.
Yeah, somebody should have brought that up. Has the reaction from Los Angeles as a whole, by way of Channel 5, the big TV station, has it been kind of an appropriate reaction from all the 30 million people in Los Angeles, of knowing that the headwaters is polluted with nuclides and all this stuff? It seemed like there'd be a big reaction. I know, I mean, I saw it in the dark of the valley, so I know how well it was presented, but the cut version's played for a long time, you know, so I'm not sure if I don't know if there's been an appropriate reaction by Los Angeles proper to the fact that their headwaters is polluted with nuclides.
Well, that's
Dan could speak to that, because the city of Los Angeles and Committee to Bridge the Gap have a lawsuit against the field lab. Dan, do you want to have a comment on that? Or did we lose Dan?
I don't
know. I can't.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry. So the city of Los Angeles Natural Resource Defense Council and Committee to Bridge the Gap filed suit against the Department of Energy about 15 years ago when DOE wanted to walk away from cleaning up the nuclear area. And we won that lawsuit, but DOE has not stopped trying to break its commitments on the cleanup. We and several other groups are party to another lawsuit against the Department of Toxic Substances Control and the Department of Public Health over their plans to allow Boeing to tear down its nuclear buildings and recycle the radioactive metals into the consumer metal supply and dispose of the radioactive waste in sites other than radioactive licensed sites. There's an additional lawsuit that the parents are part of, and you may want to describe, that's just been filed to try to overturn this backroom deal that Boeing and the state have entered into, breaking promises by the Newsom administration and allowing Boeing to walk away from about 95% of the contaminated soil at the site.
Right.
Well, let's talk about the Cayugas Creek watershed. This is something that was a little bit a shock to Jenny and I, as we were, every day Jenny and I are learning more about the site as well. Dan has over 40 years history. Bonnie, Bill, there are people here who've been involved in this much longer than Jenny and I have, and they've just put in so much work and dedication and research. We're still learning every day. And one thing that shocked us was realizing that the Cayugas Creek watershed is at risk of contamination from the Santa Susana Field Lab. And according to Boeing's proposed NPDES permit earlier this year, they were saying how important it is to make sure the Cayugas Creek watershed is protected because much of the population in that watershed relies on the groundwater for drinking water. And they were saying by limiting the pollutants in the SSFL surface water discharge, the amount of pollutants entering the surface waters and groundwater basins are correspondingly reduced. So that's one of the reasons why having the NPDES, a protective NPDES permit matters. It is not especially as protective as we would like right now. Earlier this year, Boeing proposed a permit that was dramatically weaker. And now with the settlement agreement and the MOU, things just keep getting worse for the protective measures to make sure that we're safe in our drinking water and the groundwater.
And something else that pertains to the Cayugas Creek watershed, if we can just go back to the the outfall map really quickly. Something that wasn't mentioned on the site or alluded or described in their maps is all those orange outfalls. We did those, color-coded those because those drain to Arroyo Simi in the Cayugas Creek watershed. That was not mentioned. So when these overflow at the top, they go into the Arroyo Simi.
What's also important about that watershed is if you've driven through, the 23 or whatever, there's a lot of agriculture down there. So there's stuff growing everywhere. And that's important, that we want to have, human health in the environment, but also, we don't want to have toxic food that they're growing.
Correct. And this Cayugas Creek watershed goes all the way through Oxnard, which is kind of like the strawberry basket of the world practically. And there's good reasons why this watershed should be protected, and we're not seeing the most health protective measures being advocated for by the DTSC, by the Water Board, Quality Control Board, or by the expert panel. It seems, and I think that's the impression that probably everyone who went on the tour, went to the meeting, had, is that these agencies are using the least protective measures. They're not even going for the low-hanging fruit of what they could do to really protect the populations who rely on these watersheds. Jenny, did you want to read this one?
Sure. So Tevin Schmidt, I don't know if any of you met him. He was a tall guy in an orange cap that asked some nice, loud, direct questions. His name, again, is Tevin Schmidt. He's from the Wishtoyo Shumash Foundation. He's a watershed scientist for Wishtoyo. And he has given us this quote that we can use, which is that the SSFL has been and continues to pollute the surrounding watershed and groundwater basins for decades, causing irreparable harm to sensitive plants, wildlife, and residents of the nearby areas. So we'll get to this further, but as we saw, all those outfalls are being drained to unlined ponds. So it is harmful to the groundwater, but also to all the critters in the environment.
So one of the problems we had during the tour, one of our criticisms, is that the contamination and the sources were not addressed properly. Boeing's expert panel didn't mention the true source or the extent of the contamination at the Santa Susana Field Lab. So we're going to go through a little bit of that right now.
The expert panel, as anyone on the tour experienced, blamed all the dioxin contamination, which their tour focused on, primarily on dioxin contamination, on the telephone poles. And that is what they mapped out and analyzed and discussed throughout the tour and the meeting. So there were a couple times with the expert panel, I think maybe twice, I heard them refer to impacted soils, but they didn't discuss the partial nuclear meltdown, the extensive tens of thousands of rocket engine testing, any of the radioactive work or the accidents, any of the intentional and accidental spills, explosions, detonations that wasn't gone into. We focused on the poles. And so they left out the reason why this site is being remediated in the first place. It is.
And we're standing there at the burn pit. The burn pit, a source of dioxin, and they're blaming it on telephone poles.
Bill, why don't you give us a little background on that burn pit?
Well, the burn pit is the Dan Hirsch has the famous photos where they were shooting barrels and disposing of waste, and this was over here at Outfall 11, and they couldn't figure out why between Outfall 11 and Outfall 1 that there was contamination, because there was no work that was done. But you know, if you're burning something, it's not going to stop at a fence line. You know, you're going to have some runoff, or you're going to have some smoke or whatever. But there's even written testimony from workers that when they would light something on fire, it would blow up, and sometimes debris would spread everywhere. Sometimes even 55-gallon drums on their own would fly through the air and land in other areas that weren't supposed to be the burn pit. And so the expert panel was trying to figure out why are there's dioxins and stuff like that in an area that's supposed to be non-operational, but they're not taking anything into consideration except for these telephone poles that are in there.
Well, I think Dan called it properly earlier. He called this the gravy boat for the expert water panel. You know, they get paid by Boeing to not find any real contamination, because if they did, of course, then Boeing would be responsible for cleaning it up. So
also, I think they're regulated, like, you know, when they have a task, they're like, okay, here are the documents for your research. They're not giving them all the data.
Well, the fact that we have data and we're able to access it as the public, I feel like they could access it if they felt like it, but I feel like they have vested reason not to find it. I feel like they just put on blinders of not asking bigger questions, because obviously telephone poles exist across California and they're not seeing these same levels of dioxins. But regardless, I don't know if anyone else was on the tour. It just felt kind of like we were taking crazy pills. You know, telephone poles, really? We're at one of the most contaminated sites in California, and they were talking about telephone poles. Annalisa, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, I just want to add too that they also mentioned like the asphalt at some point, and they were like throwing out like it could be coming from the telephone poles or the asphalt, and then somebody asked directly like, do you think it's coming from the asphalt? And they were like, no. Like, so then why did you try to distract us with that? Like it just seemed, it seemed weird.
It especially when these are reportedly world famous scientists who deal with this sort of an issue. But again, we've seen very, you know, people who used to have good reputations as scientists and couldn't find any links between cancers and contamination. So these are not the only scientists who can be paid to put blinders on. And I think they certainly did that.
So Tevin has posted in the chat, dioxins can be sourced from incomplete combustion of waste and the incineration of garbage. Dioxins are also found in wood preservatives and the creation of fire retardants used in telephone poles. Boeing sampled the soils around the telephone poles to test for dioxin, but their sampling efforts were minuscule and not statistically sound, with only 5 or 6 samples per study radius. Thanks.
That's why I love having scientists on these calls. Okay. Speaking of which, Jenny?
Well, I love this. This is a slide that was presented during the Boeing meeting, if you weren't in attendance. And if you were in attendance, the slide kind of shows it for, you know, it shows us where the majority of the contamination is. It's the RFI soils all the way over on the right. But what we spent the whole day in meeting discussing are the sampling data from the telephone poles on the left of the dotted line. So their own data is showing that the majority, go for it, Dan.
I just want to point out to you how misleading the graph is. If you look at the vertical axis on the left, you'll note that you would normally think that that was in normal numbers, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There, it's an exponential set of units. So you have values of 10 to the minus 7th, and then the next line is 10 to the minus 5, 100 times higher concentrations. And the next line is 100 times higher than that, 10 to the minus 3. So they're showing that there is some dioxin in treated poles, and there's a little bit of that dioxin that is coming off into the soil nearby. But if you look at the far right-hand set of dots, you see large numbers of those dots that are really high, and they are higher than in the soil near the treated poles. And again, because it's a factor of 100 for each line, we're talking about thousands of times higher. You don't do this if you're an independent scientist working for the public. You do this if you are paid by a polluter for 15 years, large amounts of money to try to rationalize their contamination. This is one of the most contaminated sites in the country. And it's frankly demeaning to you members of the public to have this panel paid for by the polluter focusing on telephone poles instead of the decades of hazardous waste, hundreds of contaminants of concern released from tens of thousands of rocket tests, propellant development, munitions development, reactors, and all sorts of chemical treatments of nuclear materials. And I think it's frankly offensive for all of you who live near the site and whose children and yourselves face a risk for people to try to focus on telephone poles. It's just over the top.
Well, and the graph itself, I really appreciate you breaking it down for us, because this is what we were shown and it was not discussed or explained in anywhere near, you know, as thorough as you just did. So thank you so much, Dan. We appreciate you.
Neither did they mention the reactor experiment. This is potentially one of the largest nuclear accidents in America. In the 1959 sodium reactor experiment, we call it the SRE. And even though this is in Area 4, which is part of the Department of Energy's area of responsibility through the NPDES permit, any reactive, waste coming out of Area 4 through the wastewater, through the surface water, is also part of Boeing's purview of protecting that surface water, as Boeing holds the permit for the entire property for the NPDES.
They would also divert the SRE drainage into the Silvernail Pond. So that's a big factor.
I didn't know that.
Did not know
Dan,
that.
since your students discovered this information, do you want to add anything?
So this accident occurred in 1959. And the company that ran the facility, the predecessor to Boeing, and the Atomic Energy Commission, the predecessor to the Department of Energy, did not disclose to the public that the accident had happened. 5 weeks later, they issued a press release embargoed for Saturday morning papers that said a parted fuel element had been observed, no evidence of unsafe operating conditions, no releases of radioactivity. As you'll see, it didn't part, it melted. So this is when my students uncovered the document and they opened up this fold-out photograph. And the label comes from the government itself, not us. And nuclear fuel is not supposed to melt. The radioactivity stays in the fuel when the fuel is solid. But when it melts, radioactivity can be released in volatile form. And it wasn't a single rod, it was a third of the fuel. And clearly evidence of unsafe operating conditions, one of the worst accidents in nuclear history. And they were, at the time of the press release, which was weeks after the accident, still venting radioactive gases into the atmosphere. So my students, 20 years later, uncovered the documents. We took it to NBC and the LA Times, and that was the first time the public was informed. And what's astonishing is that the pattern of behavior, which is that the public doesn't matter, the environment doesn't matter, cutting corners on safety is all that they do, even though these are different people now than the people who were in charge in 1959. The institutions remain the same, and the captured nature of regulatory agencies remain the same. They're simply repeating over and over again the same disregard for those people who live in the area nearby.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a government culture. We've been told that same attitude of cutting corners and really covering for mistakes others have made, even in the distant past, is the Department of Energy's government culture, and it's Boeing's culture. It's their corporate culture, and we saw that obviously with the plane crashes and the fact that that was due to Boeing cutting corners and trying to make sure their profit share, their shareholders profited over the lives of hundreds of people. So until these cultures change, it's not going to be voluntary. This is the same problem that we're going to just keep running into, and that's why it's so important that the public is informed and educated, and that we're pushing back, because these agencies aren't right now. They are not working in the public's best interest by any means. Over 4 decades, there were numerous nuclear accidents, spills, releases, explosions on the site. There were over 10 reactors, including the SRE, at the Santa Susana Field Lab. 4 of those, including the SRE, had accidents, including fires at the hot labs, which released radioactive gases. There was a plutonium fuel facility at the Santa Susana Field Lab. Plutonium is one of the most dangerous elements on Earth. Again, you had sites of illegal open air radioactive waste being burned. That's the Area 4 burn pit. This site, it's like, I don't know if anyone else felt this on the tour, but you would have thought that we were touring like the Dove soap waste site, from the way that they were just so nonchalantly talking about, the contamination and the groundwater and all this. They weren't talking about it for what it actually was. It's an incredibly dangerous, very active site used for decades and decades of contamination, tons of records of cutting corners, of even disregarding safety measures that they knew about back then.
I love these photos, because now when we went through the beautiful landscape, I'm sure everyone was impressed with how beautiful the site is, but this is an image of a rocket engine test. Those were conducted for what, 60 years? Is that the math? That's a long time. And the TCE and other solvents that were, literally dumped into the groundwater, we also can't see it, but it is there and it needs to be remediated.
I think this picture also shows the disregard for the nature. Now Boeing's narrative is all about how pro-nature they are, pro-environment. This rocket engine test was not done by Boeing, but just, again, that corporate culture, that agency culture of, what's the word that I'm looking for, that we've been learning in our EJ groups, Jenny, of extraction, and that this was not built to protect the environment. This was not environmentally friendly work they were doing. And this picture reminds me that narrative is recent, and it's PR based, it's greenwashing, and it's not the truth of the site as it existed. There were thousands of rocket and missile engine tests. Estimates are about 30,000 of them over 60 years, which resulted in huge releases of toxic materials to air, soil, and water. They currently estimate about 500,000 gallons of TCE, which is a toxic solvent, in the soil and groundwater because of all the rocket engine testing.
These were the images that Bill was referring to earlier of the burn pit, where they disposed of all the chemicals, oxidizers, explosives. And you can see the fumes from the photo going into the environment completely unregulated.
There's over 310 contaminants of concern historically found at the Santa Susana Field Lab. This is just some of them. I'm just going to read off a few quickly, but things like cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium-239, which, by the way, has a 24,000 year half-life, tritium, which is radioactive water, which I didn't know existed until I started getting into all this. In 2012, the EPA found radiation in hundreds of samples at the SSFL, and some places over 1,000 times background. Background being the natural existing radiation. Chemicals include TCE, perchlorate, dioxins, heavy metals, PCBs, and various other volatile and semi-volatile organics. Many of these are regulated at few parts per billion. I think I read TCE, the maximum contamination limit, I believe, is 5 parts per billion for drinking water, and has been found at, hundreds to thousands of times a part per billion at the Santa Susana Field Lab. Jenny, go ahead.
One of the important parts of this discussion when we're looking at the radionuclides is it was mentioned by, I think his name is John, from the expert panel, Boeing's expert panel. And I believe that he said, oh, we've only found a few, we've only had a few exceedances of radionuclides. That is completely ignoring and omitting that radiation has been found in hundreds of samples, and at times.
Well, these are soil samples, and I think he was, talking about.
But he didn't mention the soil samples, so it made it sound. I don't know if anyone else felt this way, but I thought that the intent was, which maybe I shouldn't be talking about Boeing's intent, but it felt like what they were trying to communicate is that radionuclides were not a big concern, because they didn't explain that there are radionuclides in the contaminated soils that we also weren't talking about. So that if one was on the tour and had no knowledge of the history of the nuclear work there and the contamination to the soil, you wouldn't have walked away knowing any different. And so that was a huge issue.
Problem 2, this is one that Jenny has a big heart for lately. We've been working with other environmental justice communities across California who are also being regulated primarily by the Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC. And the thing that's horrifying and yet also kind of relieving is that they're all going through the same exact kind of problems we are. It's horrifying to know that these problems are so common. Things like reports that are not scientifically, sound, things like not being able to get meetings with these agencies or the representatives, or these agencies having polluter, clearly favoritism towards the polluter and not protecting people. That problem is very common. It was relieving only to know that we're not crazy. This is happening at almost every contaminated site across California, these exact same problems with the exact same people that we're having problems with the exact same agency. And so this was something that has become especially important to us. And I'm going to let Jenny talk about that.
So potential nuclear waste in BMP filters. Even though it was suggested that there aren't radionuclides in their filters, Boeing's created the bioswales. The ones we saw at the end of the tour near the parking lot is the one that we got to see, and there were maps of them in our handout. They serve as a way to passively filter contaminants from the surface water SSFL. So the water comes down, goes directed underground, and eventually are absorbed into those carbon filters. And the filtration system at SSFL is designed to capture a range of contaminants from the forever chemicals, the PFASs, heavy metals, toxic materials, radioactive particles, even though the expert panel said that radioactive particles aren't a problem in the surface water. But due to the extensive radioactive contamination on site, remediation, waste, and debris must be sent to sites that are licensed specifically to receive low-level radioactive waste. Low-level radioactive waste, for those of you who may not know, does not mean that the levels of radioactive waste are low. It means that it's not spent fuel. It's everything else. So that term, low-level radioactive waste, or LLRW, is I believe, intentionally misleading to make you think that it's not dangerous. But our 2010 cleanup agreement, the AOC, Administrative Order on Consent, dictated that remediation waste and debris must be sent to licensed sites licensed to receive radioactive waste. But I don't know how many of you remember, it was asked where the filters are sent, and they said that they were sent to Buttonwillow. Buttonwillow is one of 2 hazardous waste sites in California. It is not licensed to receive radioactive waste. DTSC has sent radioactive waste from SSFL to Buttonwillow before. Now, both communities on both sides have opposed this. Dan can go into the history of that if he would like to, but the point is Buttonwillow and Kettleman are not licensed to receive the waste. They are not prepared. They do not know that it's coming, so therefore the workers aren't prepared. And the sites aren't designed to house it. We've had situations where the concrete has been recycled for then construction use that could be potentially have contaminated with radioactive components. So we're still, last Monday, before we went to the SSFL site tour, we actually went on a toxics tour and we went to Buttonwillow. We met people from the other site, Kettleman City. The reason why we didn't have Buttonwillow Buttonwillow community members is because when the community at Buttonwillow had tried to sue the site, the site won and intimidated the community. So they apparently aren't showing up for all these advocacy efforts. But we feel very strongly that we do not want our waste to be sent to another community that is not designed to receive it. And so with I think it was the DOE demolition, when we attended DTSC meetings to find out where that debris was going to be going, again, they were planning to send it to an unlicensed site, and we had to fight again to prevent that from happening. So on the SSFL site tour on Thursday, we learned that they are still sending these filters to unlicensed sites.
And we just wanted to point this out, one, because we want to stand in solidarity with the people of Buttonwillow and Kettleman City who are fighting to protect their communities from these toxic waste sites, leaching chemicals and contaminants into their groundwater and soil. And also because this is why the DTSC was created, was to avoid loopholes like this one. They're missing opportunities to protect the public. And this is it's why the regulating agency was created in the first place, and they're missing opportunities. And again, this is radioactive waste is not a short-term contaminant. These last for decades to centuries to thousands of years, even hundreds of thousands of years in the case of plutonium-239 as far as their danger level. Problem 3 was ineffective best management practices, BMP. You may have heard them say BMP several times. The stormwater panel has devised multiple ways to prevent stormwater effluent. Effluent is the contaminated stormwater from rain runoff. And these practices are called the BMPs.
So Bill or Dan, this is where we could probably use a little help. So we've listed the examples of the BMPs. I know what the bioswells are. That's what we saw at the parking lot. And the lower lot biofilter. I don't know what the culvert modifications and media filters are necessarily. I don't know how important it is. We definitely saw the active stormwater treatment systems at Silvernail. And I know that's one at the R2 pond, but I don't know if anything else needs to be said about
the culvert modifications are similar to what we were talking about by the bioswells, where they've put up areas where water can drain through and it captures some of the contamination at that site, similar to the bioswales, which store that water to let it filter through their media that they put there to catch contamination. I'm not sure what the ELV treatment is. I wasn't able to find anything about it online. Bill, do you have anything to add?
The question was, what is a BMP? Or
No, the ELV treatment.
Oh, say, so the ELV is the Expendable Launch Vehicle platform, which was developed by NASA, and that's in Area 2. And that's where the helipad is on Area 2. So being a helipad, it's all concrete. So there's a lot of stormwater runoff there. And they just have this drainage system where they have some type of culvert modifications where they have some type of screen where they're letting the water percolate down into the groundwater instead of going straight off as surface water. So they're kind of pushing the contaminated water on site and getting less violations type of thing.
It's definitely something that we saw several times, and we'll be talking more about
that.
Well,
they're bragging about the productivity about the ELV, and it's their goal is to keep the water from going off site, but it's recharging the groundwater with toxicities is what it's doing.
Dan?
So I just, pardon my hoarseness. I just wanted to explain to everybody what's the big picture of all of this. This is 2,850 acres of the most contaminated, one of the most contaminated sites in the state. Top of a plateau, so the rain wants to carry that downstream. And Boeing signed an agreement in 2007, along with DOE and NASA. And there was a second agreement signed by everybody but Boeing in 2010, requiring full cleanup of the soil by 2017. We wouldn't be having this discussion today, and there wouldn't be any need for these largely ineffective so-called best management practices, straw bales and other things, if they had lived up to that commitment. If the source of the contamination, which as one of you have pointed out, this is the headwaters of the LA River, it's important in terms of draining into Simi Valley and its aquifer and the Calleguas Creek watershed. If they had removed the source of the contamination as promised, 5 years ago it was supposed to be finished, hasn't even started. We wouldn't be even having this discussion. The purpose of the panel, and I don't like a group of people who keep having to call themselves expert and claim to be independent when the money is coming from the polluter. This is a panel of lobbyists for Boeing who have been trying to divert the attention away from the contamination at the site to these kind of dinky little filters, banks, and straw bales, and so on, which, as you'll see in a moment, have not been able to stop the violations. One of you folks in the public meeting pointed out that the violations keep occurring, even with all the stuff done. And the panel itself had a slide showing that the violations simply go up when there's more rain and go down when there's less. So, they aren't, you can't plug a 2,850 acre plateau with a few little filters. Two of the main outfalls are not rerouted at all. That's outfall 8 and 9. One of them goes into Brandeis Camp. Why don't you show us where those are? And one of those, so there you go. Yep. Outfall 9 goes directly into that children's camp and then to the Arroyo Simi, where it infiltrates into the groundwater for Simi Valley, where a substantial portion of the drinking water comes from that aquifer. Outfall 8, you see off to your right, drains to Dayton Canyon and from there to the LA River. Neither of those are rerouted. The others that you see, outfalls 5, 6, 7, 3, 4, 10, in small storms, they simply try to reroute some of that so it doesn't go off-site, but goes into an unlined pond. So to avoid getting fined for polluting surface water, they are polluting the groundwater further. It's just outrageous because they don't get fined for polluting the groundwater. They got fined for polluting the surface water. And it's just hand waving to try to get out from under the fines. and in particular to get out from under the fundamental problem of cleaning up the contamination in the soil that's picked up every time it rains. So when they talk about the treatments, the SWTS, the surface water treatment systems, they don't work very well. Even when stuff is filtered through them, stuff gets through. When the pond overflows, it's not filtered at all. When there are large storms, the water doesn't even go to the pond, but drains directly off site. They keep getting violations. They're trying to focus on these trivial matters, which are not zero. They do some good, but they are nowhere near solving the problem. They try to focus on these trivial matters instead of the fundamental matter, which is the cleanup. The big thing you've got to know, the thing that matters the most, and what they didn't talk about in the evening meeting, and I gather they didn't talk about on the tour, is that the backroom deal that the state entered into with Boeing in May, affirmed a few months later by the Water Board, a horrendous hearing. That deal breaks the agreement to clean up the site and allows roughly 95% of the contaminated soil of the Boeing property to never be cleaned up, and then the BMPs to be removed. So to the extent the BMPs are doing any good, they're going to disappear, while only 5% of the contaminated soil of the Boeing property gets cleaned up. That's your crisis. And that's why they gave the tour, to divert attention from the fundamental scandal of breaking the cleanup promises. The BMPs don't do much good, but they will be eliminated under this agreement with the Water Board once Boeing has cleaned up a few percent of the contaminated soil. And that means that the contamination that we are currently seeing flowing off site, the violations that we're currently seeing, will get much larger from this deal, not smaller.
And one thing I want to point out too, Dan, you're so right in all this, is that that the expert panel, they're also the ones who will set the parameters to test to see if the site is cleaned up after Boeing's settlement agreement cleanup is done. And so the same way that they can't seem to find the source of any of the problems now, is going to be the same problem when they're looking for contamination to see.
You remember the line from Upton Sinclair that you can't get someone to see something that they're being paid not to see.
Right. Right.
These people are being paid collectively hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to assist Boeing in getting out of hundreds of millions of dollars of cleanup expenses. And you're all smart. You know how the system works. And regular everyday people don't matter very much in the calculations of these large polluters and the regulators who are captured by them.
Unfortunately, and that's includes children like my daughter Grace, who's a 2-time cancer survivor. And that's why we're all fighting so hard, because you know, our kids are worth protecting. So here we see the influent, that's the contaminated water coming into this, some of the BMT practices. And for example, you can see like lead under CM9, it's at 42% coming in. And then after it's been treated, the lead still is 24% above the permit level. This was touted as a great success, that they're working great, everything's great, everyone's happy, they're so proud of all this hard work, but that's still, you know, there's no, similar to radiation, there's no safe lead exposure, especially for children. And this is water that's coming off-site into the communities down below. This is just looking at the same chart that we saw here, kind of written out. You can just see all the effluent that is still contaminated above the permit levels. So these are exceedances. This is not a complete success. You would have thought that they had just won a major award when they were presenting this at the meeting that evening, but actually it's a failure to completely protect the people living down below and the wildlife and the environment. And this again is showing that the BMPs that they were using, sorry, Jenny, this one's yours. Do you want it?
No, I think we've covered it.
Okay, but it's interesting now that I look at the slide on the left, you see one of these poles right here that they're claiming is causing all the dioxins. Around a lot of them, they had hay bales around every pole. It's funny that they don't even have a hay bale here. So even if they were claiming that it was protective, they weren't protecting all the dioxins. It just shows like their intent is so, you know, they talk out both sides of their mouth whenever possible. This also, oops, I'm sorry, is showing the ineffective BMPs at SSFL. Jenny, you want this one?
Sure. So if you look at the graph on the right, this is the easiest one for me to see. And I think Ben is the one who brought this up, brought this to their attention at the meeting. But the permit level, the permit limit is the dotted line going between 10 to the -9 and 10 to the -7. And the marks on the left are before treatment, the influent level, and the marks at the right are post-treatment, the effluent level. And you can see that many of them after treatment are still above the permit limit. Now, I'm not arguing there isn't a downward trend, but it is not sufficient to not be bringing the contaminants below the permit level. That is the point. That would be real remediation, but that isn't happening.
Problem 4, polluting SSFL groundwater. Several of the best management practices at SSFL are contaminating the groundwater, which in turn can contaminate other local groundwater systems. So here again, Dan and Jenny, and I think everyone who's talked so far has mentioned the fact that one of our biggest concerns was the Silvernail pond. It's unlined. And you can see here how much water is routed to it. And we're going to go into some of the problems that is posing for the groundwater.
If
so I point out in this photo that all those little indentations are footprints from animals drinking this water. I don't know if you noticed that when you were on the site.
No, but I believe it.
So I've heard about the Silvernail pond. I knew that we were routing, they were routing effluent to the pond. But I did not know that they don't start pumping into the treatment system until it reaches a depth of 8 feet. I was so astonished on site that, I guess I was horrified because look how big that area is. That's a lot of water. And they have the balloons that you can see attached, the buoyant white, bubbles that help that float so that that pipe stays away from the bottom where the settlement would, drop while we're waiting for them to turn the pump on to treat the water. It was a bit horrifying. I don't know if anyone else was horrified by this part, but the biggest issue is that it is unlined. So until it's 8 feet deep, those contaminants are allowed to drift towards the bottom in an unlined pond. And I know that they said that there's the clay soil keeps it from permeating, but for those of you who were there, you could also see that there were cracks in the ground. It is not impermeable. You can visually see it, that it isn't. So I asked Dan after the site visit, because I couldn't gather myself at the site, but he confirmed that the smaller rain events, yes, do not get treated. If that flow hasn't reached 8 feet in depth, it is left to evaporate and percolate into the groundwater.
And also this isn't a tested clay soil. It's assumed to be clay. And we need to do more research to look at some of the sampling done in areas surrounding this pond, but the pond itself, I believe, has not been tested for contamination, which is especially terrifying now that Bill says that the SRE was drained into Silvernail Pond. And again, you can see how this is not protecting wildlife. Boeing's always saying what great stewards they are of the environment. This is not good stewardship, to say the least.
Just for a second, we should go to the chat. Annalisa put, in I'll go ahead and read it because there's a whole other conversation going on there. So Annalisa wrote, what also concerns me is their reluctance to even talk about groundwater. I have not interacted with the groundwater expert panel, neither have we, Annalisa, that they mentioned, but I am guessing that they feel the same way about surface water. There cannot be this much of a gap between the regulation and monitoring of a surface water versus groundwater. And Dan Hirsch responded, Annalisa, Boeing and DTSC in the last few weeks entered into a new agreement and covenant on groundwater, allowing Boeing simply to bar domestic use of SSFL groundwater without DTSC okay and without any requirement for remediation that restores the aquifer. And we will be happy to send that release to you, Annalisa, if you'd like to see it.
A quick comment on it, Annalisa, also. DTSC published an ad in the LA Daily News to basically provide notice of this new agreement with Boeing. And it was published 1 month after the agreement had been entered into with Boeing and recorded. So it's the same pattern we have seen over and over again, which is the secret backroom deals, no environmental review, no opportunity for public input, no input by the affected local governments or NGOs like yours. And it's a very troubling development because Boeing, the state initially had ordered Boeing to restore the aquifer and to clean it up to public health levels. Boeing refused, saying that it was contaminated and therefore they were going to restrict its use. And since its use would be restricted, there wasn't any public health risk because people wouldn't be able to use it because it was polluted. And it looks like the state has, to a large degree, caved on that matter. They have now put in this covenant on domestic use and did so again behind closed doors. Yeah, there's the public notice. Not anything what anyone would really notice.
No.
But in any case, it was a month after the decision.
And one of the reasons, like you, Annalisa, that we're incredibly concerned about the groundwater is because compared to surface water pollution, investigation and remediation of groundwater are often more difficult, costly, and extremely slow. This is from Boeing's own NPDES permit, where it was talking about why it's important to protect the groundwater. And it definitely felt like the general philosophy of Boeing and the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board and even the DTSC is, make the problem go away as quickly as possible now and not worry about the way that that's going to impact future generations. By rerouting this contaminated surface water into unlined ponds, they might have less exceedances now, but in the future, centuries from now, especially with the climate change making water more scarce in California, and people are going to be looking for more drinking water, they're going to be tempted to go to these aquifers and to this groundwater that we are polluting now and putting future generations of people and wildlife at risk.
And I hate to go on a tangent, but I'm going to, I'll keep it very short. But when we did the toxics tour up in Central California, what we learned, which I was not aware of, is that the groundwater up there is greatly contaminated. We went to Shafter, and the danger of this long-term is there are communities of folks in California that have legal notices sent to their house that they are not supposed to drink their water because what is coming in through the pipes is groundwater. Now that isn't the situation that we're at right now, but in that disclosure, that covenant, it says that they can use that groundwater for irrigation. And the issue with that is then they're spraying it or, using it to water the food that we are all eating. And people are eating our produce, around the country. So this is not being contained. This is not being remediated. It is being spread off-site.
Well, Jenny, can I jump in real quick? I think the irrigation that they're talking about in the covenant has to do with watering like the wildlife plants on site. Oh. But that just for this, because this is talking about not being able to use, that's the covenant bars any kind of like domestic use of this water. But so they're talking about like dust suppression during the construction things like that, where again, though, it's still putting the contaminated groundwater. Hey buddy, I'm on camera right now. Thank you. Contaminated groundwater, if you're using it for dust suppression, that's blowing it into the air. Now you've aerated these contaminants, and using it for irrigation is again bringing it up to the surface, which is dangerous. It's putting it, this contamination back into plants that animals will eat. It goes all through the food chain. It's a bad deal. And so the Pacific Pier Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility Director Jeff Rooch made this statement today that this deal condemns Santa Susana to serve as a perpetual sacrifice zone dedicated to corporate convenience. And that's absolutely the truth. This is the least protective, least responsible method possible. So instead of cleaning up the contaminated groundwater, they just don't want us to drink it. And they're not going to look at risks that poses to other local waterways, to other groundwater systems. They're just going to not look past that and say, as long as nobody's drinking the groundwater at the Santa Susana Field Lab, that's good enough for them. And this is bottling up a toxic plume for eternity and then walking away. And it's a deal that most polluters would love. And that's not surprising that DTSC made this covenant with Boeing, because they did the settlement agreement, which is essentially the same deal over and over. The same with the MOU is that Boeing doesn't want to have to pay for the contamination. They don't care if our lives are at risk, our health is at risk, our general well-being. And instead, they're just looking to turn a profit.
But they did not mention that covenant at the tour. They did not. When we asked about contamination of the groundwater, they said, oh, it's probably not happening. They did not mention that the people who pay their checks, Boeing, has actually struck a deal where they are not going to clean it up. That was not admitted.
In fact, this is probably the whole reason why they had this tour. And we'll get more into it. We want to take some more time to really give you a really sound presentation about groundwater contamination, because it's a little complicated. Sorry, my dogs are jumping up on my bed, so it'll be a second here. But essentially, they were really downplaying the risks to the groundwater and how the interaction. In fact, when we asked about they said that they worked often with the groundwater panel, because this is a surface water panel, right? And they said, oh yeah, they're always collaborating with that groundwater panel. And Elisa, Tevin, or Bill, correct me if I'm wrong in that, but I mentioned that there is no groundwater panel. I was shocked. Like, what do you mean groundwater panel? We've been asking, we want to get a hold of this groundwater panel because we're really concerned about the groundwater. And it turns out there is a groundwater panel. It's also a Boeing panel. So you can imagine how much good that's going to do. And they're not very active. They do a once-a-year report. We're going to dig more into that. We'll bring you back more details on that. But I was really disappointed, but more like disgusted that the groundwater was not really being taken into the consideration that I thought would have been responsible by a surface water panel. You would assume that the surface water panel would care about groundwater health as much as they did surface water, but that was not the case. Did anyone who was else part of that tour want to speak to that at all? I think Annalisa, you did in the chat there, but surface water seems like a short-term problem compared to the groundwater contamination.
The only other thought I had is that idea of like, oh, as long as it's not used for drinking water, also just kind of like pretends like that contamination is never going to migrate further than it already has. And like, yeah, groundwater moves slowly, but it moves. Like, I don't know where that thought is coming from.
Northern California, most of the attention on groundwater is focusing on the subsidence, the dropping of the land by 30 to 50 feet around Fresno. And simply the fact that the water tables the aquifers are so depleted in some areas that a lot of shallow wells go dry. The big corporate wells go deeper and keep on taking it out. That's what the focus is on. The contamination is always a big problem also, because the more shallow wells get more contamination. And so it's a groundwater considerations are a big mess up in Central and Northern California. Same thing, but it's they're just Sigma SGMAs. They're trying to deal with that, and then they've got these laws, you know, of compliant that are not going to be complied with as far as getting water back into the aquifer, which is you know, dreaming, because a lot of it's clay soils. You can't get water back into it, but there's still techniques though that might be able to reinsert water back into to at least stop the subsidence. Contamination, and of course, there's a lot of talk about PFAS and things like this. You know, Boeing is not doing any reverse osmosis, RO, which is the only way to get rid of PFAS, you know, and these smaller contaminants. So it just underscores the fact that they're just doing very topical things there in Santa Susana. They're not really addressing the cleaning up water, and they know it. They're just doing topical stuff. You know, you have to go all the way to reverse osmosis to catch the really raunchy stuff, you know, including nucleides, I suppose. But they don't even talk about nucleides when they're talking about water purification systems and returning wastewater to drinkable. They don't get to the kind of intensity that Santa Susana gets into. They're not worried about nucleides. They're worried about pesticides and herbicides and the effects of algal blooms caused by fertilizers. You know, that's as far as they go, which is kind of small compared to what Santa Susana is looking at.
This
Right.
covenant shows that they aren't worried about any of that. What they're worried about is not paying exceedances on contaminants going off site, and they are fine with directing it to the groundwater because they're not going to have to clean it up. And that's the negotiations they've made.
Kevin, I see your hand is up. Kevin,
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in Boeing's own reports, like going back to like 2005, 2007, or sometime around there, they discuss that perched aquifer, you know, under SSFL feeds groundwater gaining springs, about 28 of them in the surrounding areas. So that groundwater is absolutely connected to like groundwater dependent ecosystems and surface water. And those pools and ponds, it's not a crazy stretch of the imagination to consider that those ponds have a significant nexus to the other water bodies and rivers in the area. But also, like, you know, I feel like in my experience, most groundwater hydrologists and geologists, it's just a bunch of guesswork about where fault lines are. There's nothing really telling us that perched aquifer isn't hydrologically connected to drinking water supply. If it, you know, we already see that it's connected to surface water. So
just a little aside, Tevin, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to drive through the area when it rains. I haven't lived here very long. 2018, I moved. And when it rains, when you drive through the areas, you can look up into the rocks and it looks like they're diamonds. It's water coming out of the seeps all over the land. And before I learned about SSFL, I thought it was so beautiful. And now when I look at it, it's a little scary because you can see it. You can see that the water is not staying in one place and it's not, you know, perfectly regulated and perfectly controlled. It's fascinating.
We have about 3 minutes left. I wanted to see if you have a question that you would like to ask. I think we've all come away with the same basic understanding that, you know, until there's a cleanup of the contaminants at the source, this problem is going to keep happening. And whether or not they try to hide the contamination coming off site in the surface water, if they try to minimize the exceedances, the problem remains. But besides that, I think we have time for maybe one more question. If you want to raise your digital hand, please feel free. Jim Porter. Oh, you got to unmute. There we go. Oh, we can't hear you. Here, hold on. Wait, one more time.
Aha.
There we go. There we are. Hello. Thank you.
Well, you know, I'm relatively new to this group, even though I've lived here in the northwest end of Chatsworth for 37 years, known about the facility up there, remember hearing the engines like most of us do that have lived here a long time. And this is about my 5th session after being kind of a member here for a year. And while I learn a lot of stuff that's pretty scary, it kind of reminds me of my years in Vietnam. And what I mean there is they'd say, go take that hill. You say, okay, why? Well, because we need to. Well, why? And what's going to be the result? Well, we'll only take about 70% casualties probably. Okay, so what if the remaining 30% take that hill? Then what? Well, then we get to go take the next hill. And well, what if we take that one? Well, then we go take the next one. And you see where I'm going with this. It's doom information you're getting, but if you accomplish the first part, it's doom information on the second and third and fourth part. So the question I guess I'm trying to get to here is, since we know all of this horrible stuff and we know absolutely nothing's going to be done about it because there is no agency willing to put the pressure on, government agency, that is, everything from local council all the way up to the president of the United States, nor any corporation, I have trouble understanding what all this information does but scare the hell out of me. And I guess that's more of a statement than a question, but that's kind of how I see it.
You know, Jim, I can understand that feeling. Sometimes I feel that exact same. There's a few things happening right now, and one thing that is already in motion is a CEQA lawsuit to try to strike down the settlement agreement and the MOU that would get them back to the drawing board where, you know, residents like ourselves, which is part of the reason why we're doing the education system now, because if we can get that agreement to open up again and go through public review like it should have, that's where we can come in and say, well, hey, why are you not looking at this? You know, we can start to point out the faults in the settlement agreement that will force them to actually do a health protective cleanup agreement again. So part of this depressing education is we're hoping that we're going to be able to use it going forward, getting the settlement agreement open again, getting the cleanup agreements to be written the correct way with the CEQA lawsuit that we're in right now. The second thing that we could use help with is people starting to reach out to their elected officials, because we actually do have a lot of local elected official support. Part of the problem right now is not only the holidays, but the transition of governments right now. We have new supervisors. In fact, we don't even know who some of the Ventura County supervisors are going to be yet. They're still counting votes. And one of the things that we're going to need to happen by the end of this year is the EIR is coming out, the Programmatic Environmental Impact Report. And that's kind of like the backbone of the cleanup. It's the manual, and it's going to go through every part of the cleanup. We're already anticipating that Department of Energy and NASA are going to break out of their cleanup agreements the same way Boeing did earlier this year. And so we need the cities and counties of Los Angeles and Ventura County to go after a lawsuit over this PEIR, already assuming that it's going to be worse than what we're imagining. And right now, that's not a priority to a lot of these transitioning governments and government agencies. And that's why we're going to need to be informed so we can take this to our elected officials and say this has to be a priority, because we're going to have a limited time frame of when these lawsuits can come out. And if the government agencies aren't active and on top of it, they're going to miss that window. And that's really what we need in order to make sure the cleanups come back. Dan, go ahead, jump in. And Annalisa, I saw your hand up. I promise I'll come back to you, but I think Dan's probably going to be addressing
No, why
this.
don't we have Annalisa first?
Oh, okay. Annalisa, go ahead. And Jen, thank you
I'll
for
be
your...
super quick because honestly, Melissa, I think you you covered a lot of it, but I'm also very new to all of this, and I'm so grateful to Melissa and Jenny and Daniel and all the folks who have helped to educate me on this this site. But I work with Heal the Bay. It's a nonprofit based out of Santa Monica. And in my limited experience working in the world of environmental advocacy, there is nothing that will drive change like public pressure. It might seem daunting, but the biggest success stories that I've seen and that I've been a part of are really driven by the public. You do definitely need like strong enforcement as a second prong, but we're probably only going to get that if we pressure the board to do so. And then the third prong that is part of that success story is the funding. But honestly, in this case, that's not Boeing has money. That's not the part that I'm focused on this one. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because this is terrifying information, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts on it. But I also hope you know that public voices have more of an impact than sometimes it feels like. I sometimes speak. I speak on behalf of Heal the Bay. I don't speak on behalf of any community, but it often feels like it's falling on deaf ears, and it's very disheartening and it's very difficult. But it's also can make a huge difference. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you. That's really encouraging, actually. I really appreciate that, Annalisa. Dan, why don't you go ahead and finish final comments for tonight?
So Jim, you're asking exactly the right question, and I'm exactly the wrong person to answer it, because I am more depressed than anyone on this call. I have spent 43 years trying to get this facility first shut down, health studies then conducted for the workers and for the public, and then to get cleanup. And I thought we had it in hand by these remarkable cleanup agreements. So the easiest thing for me to tell you is that you're free to not do anything about this. There's nothing that can be done. But in the real world, there are really three types of fights. One type is when nothing you do is going to matter, which is your image of Vietnam. There's always going to be another hill. There's going to be more of you folks killed, and there's never going to be an end. There's a second type of battle, which is it doesn't matter what you do because it's going to be won anyway. Those are really easy morally, right? You don't have to do anything when you can't do anything. You don't have to do anything when it doesn't matter because someone else will take care of it. This is a middle one where you can actually save some lives by doing some relatively simple things. And let me give you a couple of concrete examples right now. You say you're in Chatsworth. Who is your city council member? Is it John Lee? A phone call to John Lee or his office tomorrow or early next week can make almost all the difference on whether we win or lose on Santa Susana. The Los Angeles City Council passed a resolution long ago directing the city attorney to file a lawsuit if the toxics agency issues its environmental impact report without fixing it to comply with the full cleanup of the site. That action by the state is supposed to occur, they say, before the end of the year, meaning they're going to try to get it out during the holidays. The city would have 30 days to be able to sue. And the difference between whether we win this or lose this is whether the city of LA, the county of Los Angeles, the county of Ventura, all of them or one of them does what each of them is on record to do, which is to take legal action to enforce those agreements. John Lee will care if he hears from you and a few other of his constituents. Who is your county supervisor? Is it Kuehl or is it Barger? Do you know?
Kuehl.
If you could call Kuehl's office over the next couple of days, I'm talking about something that takes a couple minutes, and talk to the staffer who handles Santa Susana. She's been deeply committed on Santa Susana long before she got on the board of supervisors. LA Board of Supervisors passed a resolution directing its county council to prepare a lawsuit if the cleanup to background was breached. She's leaving office in a few weeks. She still can do something. Those calls make the difference. Boeing has not been able to get away with everything it's wanted to do over these years because it's been fought by people like you who are willing to pick up the phone, send an email, talk to a legislative aide. Those things are the way we fight this. So this is not a battle about hills that there will always be another hill and we'll never get up. It's not a Sisyphus matter, of pushing up a boulder up a hill, which will always come back down. It's also not something that someone else, if they take care of it, you don't have to. I know that Lee's office matters in the next few days. We believe that the state's going to try to sneak this out during the holidays so that there's almost no time to review the final EIR, and so that the local governments during the transfer of power, right? It's a time when there's always mischief. Kuehl will be out, replaced by, remind me of her name, Lindsay Horvath.
Yeah.
Horvath will take some time to get up to speed. Kuehl will be gone. And it's exactly during that period that the state and Boeing plan to do this move. You can alert them enough so that they may be able to do what they've already gone on record to do. So long statement, but I'm telling you, you're in a worse position than if there was nothing you could do, or if it's going to work out easily without you. There is something you can do. It wouldn't take a lot of time and would actually make a real difference.
Well, I do better than that, Dan. I actually go in person to the city councilman's office because I go by it usually at least once a week.
Isn't it right next to the toxics department's office, which is causing all the trouble?
No, his council office.
No, I know. Oh, you mean the downtown one you go to?
No, the one out in the valley here.
Okay, but anyhow, you go see him. He wanted to meet with us in person a few weeks ago, and it ended up having to be by Zoom. Go and talk to him. He needs to know. Do you remember the old story about Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt? A bunch of people went and met with Roosevelt and tried to convince him of something. At the end of the conversation, he said, okay, you've convinced me. Now go out and force me to do it, right? They need to know which way the wind is blowing. They need to feel a little pressure. Talk to John Lee. Talk to, if possible, Kuehl or Kuehl staff, and then be ready to talk to Horvath when she gets in, because Boeing and DTSC are going to do mischief over the holidays and during the transfer of power.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say if anybody needs to jump off, please feel free. Amy, I'm going to let Amy ask one question, but I know that it's late, it's 8:30, and I'm deeply grateful for all of you who came to the tour, came to the meeting online or in person, or came to this follow-up meeting tonight. Your dedication is just, I always think of it as a giant dam, and we're very slowly pulling little rocks out of that dam, and it feels like we're just doing nothing, but at some point the integrity of that dam is going to fall apart, and it's because we're always picking at it, we're always pulling it apart, and we'll get there together. And the more of us there are working to get that dam down, the sooner it'll come down. I would be happy to email out tomorrow. If you are not already part of our email list, go ahead and drop your email address into the chat, or you can send it to Jenny and I at santasusanacampaign@gmail.com. We have an email blast that goes out, and we will be sending out some talking points and names and numbers of some of the elected officials, so you can reach out. Because again, when they hear from us, they forget that there's a lot of people behind us. When they hear from you directly, it reminds them like this is actually a constituent matter. This is people who will vote for them, and that has a lot to say. Amy, go ahead.
It looks like my question's being answered in the chat. I was just gonna say, do you have like talking points, like what to say to them? Because I'm more than happy to go, but I would need like a little guidance on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you would be surprised at how friendly these elected officials are, how accommodating they are, whether you send them an email, a call, or show up in person. They really do look forward to hearing from their constituents. And then, let a few friends know. I know it's Thanksgiving. This is why Boeing does these kind of shenanigans during this time of the year, because we're all have had cold and we're cooking turkeys for the family or whatever, tofurkeys. we're trying to do everything at once, but this matters, and our elected officials, they really do move when we talk to them. And like Annalisa said, it's the more we tell people, the more we have a movement going, the more effective this will be. So we'll copy out the emails. Jenny, could you copy those out real quick? Thanks, Carmi. I hope you guys all have a great Thanksgiving. Did you want to say anything else, Amy?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, oh wait, did you say Amy?
I thought it, yeah, did.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was just gonna ask, do you guys also have like a list of all the officials that we could be reaching out to? Okay, perfect. That's my question. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. We'll send that out. We'll send that out tomorrow with emails and phone numbers. Anything else? Anyone else that I'm missing? Again, I'm just really thankful for you guys all. I'm especially thankful for some of our experts who are around, like Dory and Bill, Bonnie, Annalisa, Tevin, obviously Dan, just again, for what makes us so strong is that we're all working together. And I love that we're all very different people, but we're working for the same effort, bringing in knowledge, bringing in wisdom and questions and all that. So you guys are amazing. And I'm going to end it for tonight. I hope you guys have a fantastic Thanksgiving. We'll be available by email if you have any questions or any way we can help support you as you're reaching out to your elected officials. All right. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Thanks. Happy Thanksgiving.